Humanity departed without speaking. Now the council apologizes. The microphone cut out while I was still speaking. Not a technical failure. I watched the council chair, a tall Varathi elder named Gress Van, press the button himself. His long fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as if he wanted me to see it happen, as if he wanted me to understand that my words were not just being stopped, they were being dismissed before they could finish forming in the air. I had been mid-sentence. I had been saying, the proposed sanction will cost the Kalani people access to medical, and then there was nothing. Just the low hum of the chamber's ventilation system, and the sound of several hundred alien delegates shifting in their seats with something that I can only describe as collective satisfaction. My name is Lena Vasquez. I had been a diplomat for 22 years at that point. I had learned 4 alien languages well enough to argue in them. I had read every line of the Galactic Council Charter, twice, in 2 of those languages, looking for the clauses that were supposed to protect smaller species from being steamrolled by majority votes. I had filed 41 formal objections in 6 years at the council. Not one of them had resulted in a changed outcome. Not one. I stood at the human delegation podium in Chamber 7 of the Central Council facility on Veth Sora Station and looked out at the amphitheater of species who had been deciding the rules of interstellar civilization long before humans had invented the wheel. The Varathi in their deep blue robes. The Thanari, with their bioluminescent fringe glowing faint gold under the chamber lights. The Kalani delegation, smaller and quieter than most, sitting in the far upper rows, because their species had no permanent seat and were present only as observers. Observers with no voice, no vote, and apparently no right to hear a human diplomat complete a sentence on their behalf. Director General Osei Mensah was seated 2 chairs to my right. He was 63 years old. He had been the head of Earth's Council delegation for 11 years. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He had a quality that I had always admired, which was that he communicated more with stillness than most people could communicate with an hour of talking. He was very still right now. Gress Van moved on to the next item on the agenda, as if nothing had happened. His voice was smooth and practiced, the voice of someone who had run thousands of sessions and cut off hundreds of inconvenient speakers, and felt no more than a paperweight feels when you set it down on a document. The vote came 11 minutes later. Humanity's trade access through the Saurian corridor, a route that carried 40% of our non-colony freight, was suspended for a period of no fewer than 5 years. The stated reason was that human shipping practices created friction inconsistent with Council standard logistics frameworks. There had been a complaint filed by a Varathi freight consortium 8 months earlier. The complaint had been reviewed by a committee that included 4 Varathi representatives and 0 human ones. The vote was 79 to 14. The 14 were species who either depended on human trade, owed us favors, or simply had a principled objection to what was happening. 14 out of 93 seated species. In 22 years I had watched that number go up exactly once. When the Valanthi joined the council, and their delegate, a quiet being named Orva, told me privately that he had read the human voting record and found it, in his words, embarrassing to observe. I still had my hand resting on the edge of the podium from when I had been speaking. I became aware of it the way you become aware of something only after the reason to hold it is gone. I looked at my hand. I looked at the chamber. I looked at Gress Van reading from his agenda screen, with the calm of a man who had already forgotten the last 3 minutes. Then I looked at Osei Mensah. He was already looking at me. His expression was completely neutral. Not angry, not defeated, not even sad. It was the face of a man who had made a decision before the vote was called and was simply waiting for the correct moment to act on it. He picked up his datapad. He did not turn it off or lock it. He simply set it down on the table in front of him, face up, exactly as if he expected to return to it in a moment. Then he pushed back his chair, stood, and straightened the front of his jacket. One smooth motion, like a man getting up from a dinner table. He turned toward the chamber exit. He did not look at Gress Van. He did not signal to our delegation. He did not say a single word. But every human delegate in that chamber, all 9 of us, including the 2 junior attaches who had only been on Veth Sora Station for 4 months, stood up within 3 seconds of each other. I do not know how to explain the coordination of it because there was no signal. There was no nod, no whispered instruction, no prearranged plan that I had been told about. There was simply Osei Mensah walking toward the door, and something in the way he moved that made the answer obvious. We followed him. Our footsteps were the loudest sound in the chamber because we were the only ones moving. I counted my own steps without meaning to. 12 steps from the delegation table to the exit corridor. The door was a sliding panel of brushed alloy, and it opened automatically as Mensa reached it. He did not hold it for the rest of us. He did not look back. I was the last one through. I paused for exactly 1 second in the doorway, not to make a statement, but because the instinct to turn around and say something was physically difficult to suppress. 22 years of training said, respond, argue, make them hear you. I turned around anyway. The chamber was already returning to its normal rhythms. Gress Vaughn was speaking. Several delegates were consulting their screens. The Kalani observers in the upper rows were watching us go with expressions I could not fully read. One of them, a young one, smaller than the adults around her, with the pale gray coloring of the Kalani's northern clans, was watching me specifically. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at my face. I do not know what she saw there. I hope it was not despair. I hope it was something closer to what Mensa's face had shown. Resolve, maybe. Or the particular kind of calm that comes when you have stopped waiting for permission. I walked out. The corridor beyond the chamber was empty and long, and lit with the blue-white lighting that Vethsora Station used in its administrative wings. Our footsteps echoed. Mensa was already 20 meters ahead. Nobody spoke. We walked together in a loose cluster, 9 humans on a station built by and for species who had spent decades making it clear that our presence was tolerated, but never quite welcome. One of the junior attaches, a young man named Gary Holloway who had grown up in Manchester and had only taken the posting because he thought it would look good on his record, said, very quietly, "Are we leaving?" Nobody answered him. We kept walking. I remember thinking, as we moved through that blue-lit corridor toward the docking wing, that this was a strange way to change history. No declaration, no ultimatum, no final speech that would be quoted in future textbooks. Just 9 people in formal clothes walking at a measured pace through a corridor, with the hum of a space station around them and the faint vibration of docked ships coming up through the floor. I remember thinking that it felt too quiet for something so permanent. I remember thinking that maybe that was exactly the point. Mensa stopped at the junction where the corridor split toward the docking bays. He turned around and looked at all of us for a moment. Then he said one thing, just one. "We are done asking." He said it the way you would say the time of day. Calm, factual, certain. Not a speech, not a rallying cry, just a statement of current conditions. Then he turned and kept walking. None of us asked what came next. I think we understood, in the way that you sometimes understand large things before you can articulate them, that the answer to what comes next was not going to be found by asking anyone in that chamber. It was going to be found somewhere else entirely. In shipyards and laboratories and farms on 3 continents and 2 moons. In the particular human tendency to treat a closed door not as a conclusion but as a reason to build a different building. Gary Holloway caught up to me near the docking bay entrance. He still looked uncertain, which was fair, because he was 26, and this was not what his posting was supposed to involve. "What do we tell them?" he asked. "When they ask why we left?" I thought about that. I thought about 41 formal objections. I thought about cut microphones. I thought about the Kalani girl in the upper gallery watching us walk away. "Nothing," I said. "We don't tell them anything." He looked at me like I had suggested something extreme. "The silence," I said, "is the message." We boarded our ship 40 minutes later. Nobody from the council came to the docking bay to ask questions, or make requests, or lodge a formal inquiry. Maybe they expected us to come back. Maybe they thought it was a walkout in the parliamentary sense, a temporary protest, a pressure tactic. Maybe they had spent so long not listening to us that they had also stopped watching us closely enough to notice the difference between a protest and a departure. Our ship cleared the station's traffic corridor and entered open space, and I stood at the rear observation window for a long time watching Vethsora Station shrink behind us. It was a beautiful station, objectively. The Vorathi had built it 300 years ago, and their architecture had a quality of permanence that human structures rarely achieved. It looked like it had always been there, and always would be. I watched it until it was too small to see clearly. Then I went to find something to eat, because I had not had lunch, and whatever came next was going to require that I think clearly, and thinking clearly required food. That was the day we stopped talking. It would be 9 years before we walked back into that chamber. A lot would change in 9 years. I had always believed that the measure of a civilization was not how loud it could be, but what it did with its hands when no one was watching. Humans, as it turned out, did quite a lot. I was reassigned back to Earth within 2 weeks of our departure from Vethsora Station. My official title changed from Senior Ambassador to Interstellar Affairs to something called Strategic Liaison, Earth Relations Office, which was a deliberately vague title that essentially meant I was available to be consulted when needed and otherwise free to exist without a specific function. For the first time in 11 years, I had an office with a window that looked at something other than a star field or a station corridor. It looked at a garden, a real one, on the ground, with soil and rain, and everything growing at the pace things grow when they are not being engineered to do so faster. The first thing I did was sleep for 14 hours. The second thing I did was try to understand what Earth was actually planning to do. The answer, I discovered over the following weeks, was not a plan in the way I was used to thinking about plans. There was no document titled, "What We Do After Leaving the Council." There was no single decision-maker who had architected the withdrawal as a strategic move. What there was, instead, was something more interesting and more characteristically human. A general mood, shared widely and without coordination, that the resources and energy we had been directing outward toward council participation might be better directed inward and forward. It was less a strategy than a shift in collective attention. Director General Mensah, now operating from Earth's International Affairs Building, rather than a station 60 light-years away, gave a brief statement to the press 2 weeks after our return. He said that humanity had decided to focus on its own development for the foreseeable future. He said this in exactly 3 sentences. He did not elaborate, did not take questions, and left the room with the same unhurried calm that had carried him out of Chamber 7. The Council sent a formal inquiry within the month. Earth's office processed it and sent a response acknowledging receipt. That was all. The Council sent a second inquiry. Earth acknowledged receipt of that one too. I watched this happen from my new office with the garden view, and felt something I had not felt in years, which was the faint, warm sensation of watching something go exactly right. The Jovian Relay Network had been in partial construction for 9 years. It was a communications and logistics infrastructure project connecting Earth, Mars, the asteroid mining belt, and the 4 outer system stations that served our deep space operations. It had been underfunded for most of its existence because the budget allocation for council participation, travel, station fees, diplomatic staff, translation services, the endless ceremonial expenses that interstellar diplomacy required, had consistently absorbed resources that might otherwise have gone to internal infrastructure. Within 18 months of our withdrawal, the relay network was fully funded, and construction was accelerating. I visited the Ganymede station during a tour of project sites and stood in the main operations hub while an engineer named Claire Patterson showed me the new throughput projections. Claire was 34 and had been working on the relay project since she was 27, and had the particular energy of someone who had been doing important work without enough support for too long, and could not quite believe the support had finally arrived. At this rate, she told me, tapping a display that showed signal traffic projections, we'll have full-spectrum relay coverage from Earth to the outer Kuiper stations within 2 years. That means real-time coordination across the whole system. No more lag, no more lost windows, no more relay failures during high-traffic periods. What would that have meant before? I asked. If we'd had this 10 years ago. She thought about it for a moment. The Vega colony situation would have gone differently, she said. We lost 3 months of coordination time because the relay kept dropping. People spent 6 weeks not knowing what was happening because we couldn't get consistent signal through. I nodded. The Vega colony situation was not something I liked to think about. A life support failure in a developing colony, inadequate communication infrastructure, decisions made on incomplete information by people who were doing their best with what they had. The outcome had not been catastrophic, but it had been bad enough that everyone who had been involved carried it quietly. 2 years, I said. Maybe 18 months, Claire said, with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own projections. She was right. It took 17 months. Meanwhile, other things were happening that I was hearing about, but not directly involved in. A team of engineers at the Callisto Research Facility had been quietly developing a modification to our existing faster-than-light drive systems. The Council Standard Drive, which nearly all spacefaring civilizations used in some form, had been designed by the Varathi 4 centuries earlier and had been updated incrementally since then. It worked. It was reliable. It was also, by the assessment of several independent analysts including 2 human ones whose work had been published in journals that no one in the council had paid much attention to, operating at roughly 60% of its theoretical maximum efficiency. The Callisto team's modification brought that to 91%. The practical consequence was that human ships, refitted with the new drive variant, could travel the same distance on significantly less fuel, or travel farther on the same amount. Either way, the economics of long-range shipping changed substantially. Freight that had been marginally profitable became clearly profitable. Routes that had been impractical became viable. The new drive was not compatible with council standard infrastructure. This was not an accident. I found out about it when a man named Philip Okafor, who ran the Callisto facility, sent me a briefing document flagged for my attention. Philip was 61 and had the patient, deliberate communication style of someone who had spent decades explaining complex things to non-specialists. His cover note said simply, "Thought you'd want to see this. It changes the picture somewhat." I read the document twice, then I sat with it for a while. The picture it changed was this. Humanity had spent decades operating within the council's infrastructure because we had no alternative. Our ships used their drives, our communications used their relay standards, our freight moved through their approved corridors. We were participants, yes, but we were participants whose participation was enabled by systems we did not control. If the council wanted to limit our access to those systems, and they had demonstrated clearly that they were willing to do exactly that, there was historically not very much we could do about it. The new drive changed that. Not completely, not immediately, but in the direction that mattered. I grew tomatoes that year. I had a small terrace off my apartment in Geneva, south-facing, good afternoon light, and I found that the specific combination of attention and patience required to grow things from seed was exactly the kind of mental activity I needed, while the larger situation developed without requiring my involvement. I checked on them every morning. I watered them precisely. I monitored their progress with a care that I suspect I had once reserved for diplomatic negotiations and had forgotten to apply to ordinary life. By the end of the first summer, I had more tomatoes than I could eat and had begun giving them to my neighbors, who had not asked for them but seemed genuinely pleased. One of my neighbors was an elderly woman named Dorothy Farrell, who had been a teacher before her retirement and who had strong opinions about everything and shared them without reservation. She knew I had worked in interstellar diplomacy and asked me once, directly, what I thought was going to happen. "I think the council is going to realize what they had," I said. "When?" she asked. "When they need something we have," I said. Dorothy considered this. She had the evaluating expression of a woman who had spent 40 years judging whether students understood the material. "And do you have something they need?" she asked. I thought about Claire Patterson and the relay network. I thought about Philip Okafor and the new drive specifications. I thought about the 18 other development projects I had been briefed on in the past year, ranging from terraforming advances on Titan to a new class of long-range medical vessel that had been designed specifically for crisis response in deep space environments. "Yes," I said. Dorothy nodded, as if this was the answer she had expected. "Good," she said. "Then don't go back until they understand that." I did not go back for 8 more years. But in those 8 years, something was building that the council had no instruments calibrated to detect. They were looking for protests, for formal declarations, for the kind of noise that a species makes when it is angry and wants to be heard. They had developed very good systems for ignoring that kind of noise. What they had not developed was a system for understanding what it meant when a species stopped making noise at all and simply went home and got to work. They would figure it out. They always do, eventually. But the lesson, when it came, would not arrive the way they expected it to. It would not arrive as an argument or a demand or a formal resolution. It would arrive as a crisis. And humanity's response to that crisis would say, without a single word being spoken to the council, everything that 41 formal objections had never managed to communicate. The first sign that something had changed came from a source I had not expected. Her name was Nadia Ose, no relation to Director General Mensa, though I checked when I first encountered her name in a briefing document, because the coincidence of the surname would have been remarkable. She was an economic analyst working for a small research organization called the Galactic Trade Monitoring Collective, which was funded by a consortium of mid-tier species who could not individually afford full economic intelligence operations, but could collectively afford a shared one. Nadia was 38, originally from Cardiff, and had a reputation for producing reports that were rigorous, specific, and, according to several people I spoke to, almost uniformly unwelcome to whoever commissioned them. The report she produced in the 6th year of humanity's withdrawal was titled Structural Dependencies in Galactic Council Member Economies, an Assessment of Pre-Withdrawal and Post-Withdrawal Conditions. It was 83 pages long and contained 47 data charts. I read all of it. The summary was this: 17 council member species were running trade imbalances that had not existed before humanity left the council. 3 of those species were running imbalances serious enough to qualify, under council economic standards, as fiscal distress. The primary driver in all 17 cases was the same: the disappearance of services that human operators had been providing, informally and often without formal acknowledgement, that those species had come to depend on, without ever quite noticing they had. Nadia's report documented these services in careful detail. Emergency logistics coordination during non-standard supply chain events, which was a formal way of describing situations where something unexpected happened in a system and somebody needed to improvise a solution under time pressure. Xenobiological crisis response, which was the specific set of skills required when a medical emergency in a multi-species environment needed to be managed by someone who had studied enough alien biology to avoid making things worse. Dispute arbitration for species without council seats, which was the work of sitting between 2 parties who had no formal legal framework for resolving their disagreement, and helping them find a practical solution anyway. These were not glamorous functions. They were not the kind of thing that got mentioned in council session reports or celebrated at interstellar summits. They were the equivalent of the person in any organization who knows where the backup supplies are kept, who remembers the procedure that everyone else forgot, who shows up when something goes wrong and fixes it without being asked. Humanity had been that person for decades, not for recognition, not for political capital, simply because the work needed doing, and we were capable of doing it. When we left, nobody had replaced us. In some cases, nobody had even noticed we were gone until the moment when they needed something done and called a contact number that was no longer in service. I received a copy of Nadia's report with a handwritten note from Philip Okafor that said, "Page 44 is particularly interesting." Page 44 contained a table of xenobiological crisis response incidents over the previous 20 years, broken down by which species had provided the response team. The human column was the longest one. When I reached the section covering years 6 through the present, the human column was empty. The column marked "Response Provided" had a different pattern in those years. Shorter response times in some cases, much longer ones in others. 3 incidents marked with a notation that read, "Response delayed due to specialist unavailability." I did not know what the practical consequence of specialist unavailability had been in those 3 cases. The report did not say. Some things you do not want to know in too much detail. The second sign came from a direction I had not been watching at all. A young man named Arthur Pemberton, who worked in our Foreign Ministry's monitoring division, flagged an unusual pattern in interstellar communications traffic. He was 25 and had the specific talent for noticing patterns in data that some people develop when they spend enough time staring at the right kind of information. He came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon and showed me a graph on a tablet screen, with the quiet energy of someone who was not sure whether what they had found was important or whether they were about to embarrass themselves. "This started about 7 months ago," he said. "It's communications traffic between council member species and third-party non-aligned entities. The volume increase is 40% above historical baseline." I looked at the graph. The spike was clear. "What are the third-party entities?" I asked. "Mostly independent freight contractors," he said, "some logistics consultancies, a few technical service providers. The common thread is that they're all offering services that used to be provided through council-aligned networks." "Services that humans used to provide," I said. He nodded. He had the look of someone who had suspected this conclusion and was relieved to hear it stated plainly. "They're looking for replacements," I said. "Yes," he said, "and the price data in these contracts, where we've been able to access it, suggests they're paying significantly more than the historical rates." This was, in the specific language of interstellar economics, a problem. If you are paying 40% more for a service than you previously paid, and the quality is comparable, that is an inconvenience. If you are paying significantly more, and the quality is not comparable, that is a structural issue. Nadia's report had documented the cases where quality was not comparable. Arthur's data was showing me the cost of trying to fill the gap anyway. The council, I was beginning to understand, had made a calculation when it passed that sanction 7 years ago. The calculation was that human services were replaceable, that human trade routes were a convenience rather than a necessity, that the friction of human participation in council governance outweighed the value of human participation in council logistics. It was a reasonable calculation, if you looked at the surface. We were one species among 93. We had been participating for only 60 years, which in the context of a civilization that had existed for centuries was barely a generation. What the calculation missed was the depth of integration. When you do a job long enough and well enough, you stop being the person doing the job and become the system through which the job gets done. The Vorathi had understood this about their own infrastructure for centuries, which was why they had built it in a way that made everyone dependent on it. They had not understood, or had not cared to examine, whether the same principle might apply to the informal human networks that had grown up inside and around their formal systems. They were examining it now. The crisis, when it arrived, did not announce itself as a crisis. In my experience, the important ones rarely do. It began with a stellar observation report from an automated monitoring station in the Theric Nebula, which was a region of space containing 3 inhabited systems and a cluster of recently established colony stations. The report flagged an anomalous energy signature from a mid-sized star designated Theric 7. The signature was consistent with the early stages of a coronal expansion event. Not an explosion, but a sustained and intensifying increase in stellar energy output that, if it continued, would have significant consequences for the 3 inhabited systems in the star's local influence zone. I heard about it from Arthur, who had been monitoring council emergency communications as part of his pattern work. He came to my office at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday and said, "The council has called an emergency session, Theric 7. I was already aware of the monitoring reports. I had been following the situation for 10 days, not because I had any official role in it, but because old habits do not dissolve easily, and I was still subscribed to half a dozen interstellar situation monitoring feeds that I had set up during my time at the council and never canceled." "What's their response framework?" I asked. He handed me a tablet with the session summary. I read through it quickly. The council had assembled a working group. The working group had proposed a response plan. The plan involved a specific type of vessel capable of deploying shielding infrastructure at range, a mobile installation platform that could position itself close enough to the affected zone to be effective without being endangered by the stellar anomaly itself. The plan was well considered. The working group had clearly done its work carefully. There was only one problem. The vessel type specified in the response plan, the long-range mobile installation platform, configured for stellar anomaly response, existed in significant operational numbers in exactly 1 fleet in the known settled systems. Ours. I read the specification twice to make sure I was not missing something. I was not. The Council's plan required a class of ship that humans had developed specifically for deep system crisis response over the previous 15 years. It was not a common design. It was not something you built in a hurry. You built it because you had thought hard about what kinds of situations you were likely to encounter in the outer reaches of settled space, and had decided that the ability to respond to stellar events was a capability worth having. No other species had made that decision, not because they lacked the engineering capacity, but because they had not anticipated needing it. The Council's safety frameworks had been written in an era when the known settled systems were more geographically concentrated, and the kinds of incidents that required this type of vessel were theoretical, rather than operational concerns. The known settled systems were no longer as concentrated as they had been 60 years ago. Humanity had expanded during those years. Other species had expanded too. The frontier of settled space had moved outward considerably, into regions with stellar dynamics that the older safety frameworks had not been designed to account for. There were 3 inhabited systems at potential risk in the Theric Nebula. The combined population was slightly over 400 million people, including the colony stations. The 3 inhabited planets were home to 2 species who had been members of the Council for longer than humanity had been in space. The Kalani, the same species whose young observer I had seen in the gallery 7 years ago, and the Orath, a quiet, methodical people who were known primarily for their agricultural developments and their careful, unhurried approach to everything they did. Neither species had a deep space crisis response fleet. Neither species had the technical capacity to address a stellar anomaly of this type. They were dependent on the Council framework for exactly this kind of event. The Council framework needed ships that only we had. I received a call from Director General Mensah that afternoon. He had retired 2 years earlier, but was clearly still being consulted on situations of this nature. He looked the same as he always had: controlled, present, not quite readable. "You've seen the Theric situation," he said. "Yes," I said. "The Council has formally requested a consultation," he said. "They've asked whether Earth is willing to make vessels available on a non-standard basis, outside normal Council frameworks, given that we are not currently a member." I let that sit for a moment. "A non-standard basis," I repeated. "Yes, they are, to their credit, not trying to frame this as a Council operational matter, since we are not party to Council operations. They are requesting our assistance as an independent actor." "What is our response?" I asked. Mensah looked at me steadily. "We are sending the ships," he said. 12 of them. The Theric systems will have shielding infrastructure operational within 6 weeks. The crews have already been briefed and are preparing for departure. I had expected this. Humanity was not going to allow 400 million people to face a preventable crisis because we were in a political dispute with the Council. That was not who we were. It had never been who we were. The Council had sometimes mistaken our willingness to engage diplomatically with a fundamental need for their approval, which was a misunderstanding of a fairly basic kind. We helped because the work needed doing, not because we were told to, not because there was something in it for us, because people were in a situation that was going to get significantly worse without assistance, and we had the means to help. "The crews," I said, "are they aware of the political context?" "They are," Mensah said. "Chief of Operations in the Theric response is a woman named Helen Burke. You may know the name." I did know the name. Helen Burke was 44, had been running deep system operations for 15 years, and had a reputation for the specific combination of technical excellence and complete absence of patience for unnecessary bureaucracy that you needed in someone coordinating crisis response across multiple systems under time pressure. She was exactly the right person for this. "What did she say?" I asked, when she was briefed on the situation. Mensah's expression shifted very slightly. She said, "Tell the Council we'll have it done in 5 weeks, not 6, and they're welcome." Then she went to prepare her crew manifests. I was quiet for a moment. "She also said," Mensah added, with the particular dryness he reserved for moments he found significant, "that when we're finished, she'd appreciate it if someone sent a brief note to the Council, informing them that humanity has been building crisis response capacity for 20 years, and perhaps next time they might consider that before passing sanctions." "Will we send the note?" "No," Mensah said. "Helen will have already made the point more effectively than any note could." She did. The 12 ships departed 4 days later. They traveled at full speed using the new drive variant, which meant they reached the Theric Nebula in 3 weeks, instead of the 5 it would have taken on Council standard drives. The shielding infrastructure was operational in 34 days. No Council representative was present at the completion. No ceremony was held. The human crews logged their mission reports, secured their equipment, and returned to their assignments. The Council chamber, receiving the confirmation that the Theric crisis had been resolved, was reportedly very quiet for some time. I heard about this from Urva, the Volanthi delegate who had once told me our voting record was embarrassing to observe. He sent me a brief message. It contained only 2 sentences. The chamber was quiet for 17 minutes after the confirmation came through. I counted. I read it twice. Then I set my tablet down and looked out at the garden below my office window for a while, at the ordinary, patient work of things growing in soil, and thought about mirrors, and what you see in them when you finally look. On a cold morning in late November, 6 years after the Theric response, and 9 years after we had walked out of Chamber 7, I received an official communication from the Galactic Council. I had received official communications from the Council before. The early years after our departure had brought a steady stream of them: inquiries, requests, procedural notifications, all of which Earth's office had processed, acknowledged, and filed with the particular bureaucratic precision that is itself a form of statement. The communications had slowed over time. This one was different. It was not routed through the standard administrative channels. It had been sent directly to my personal diplomatic address, which meant someone at the council had gone to the effort of finding it, which was not a trivial task since I had not updated that address in 4 years. The sender was not the council administrative office. The sender was Suvathoran, the Thanari who had been appointed chair of the Galactic Council 2 years earlier following Gressvan's retirement. I knew something about Suvathoran. She had been a delegate for 30 years before her appointment as chair. She was known, among those who followed council politics closely, for an approach to governance that was methodical, historically informed, and, by the standards of interstellar diplomatic culture, unusually direct. She had been one of the 14 who voted against the Saurian corridor sanction 9 years ago. I had not known that at the time. Arthur had found it in the voting records when he was doing background research on the new chair, and had flagged it to me with a note that said, simply, interesting. Her message was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph introduced herself and acknowledged that we had not communicated directly before. The second paragraph stated that the council wished to open a formal dialogue with Earth regarding the possibility of resumed participation. The third paragraph said, and I read this sentence 4 times, that the council recognized this dialogue would require, first, a full and honest acknowledgement of the conditions that had led to humanity's withdrawal, and that the council was prepared to provide that acknowledgement. The fourth paragraph said she would welcome a meeting, at a location of humanity's choosing, at a time that suited our schedule. At a time that suited our schedule. I sat with that for a very long time. I had spent 22 years inside the council's diplomatic culture, which had a well-developed system of hierarchy and precedence. Everything from where you sat in a chamber, to how long you waited for a response to a message communicated something about relative status. The council requesting a meeting at a location and time of our choosing was not a small gesture. It was the diplomatic equivalent of setting down something you had been carrying and acknowledging, with the act of putting it down, that you had been carrying it in a way that was not serving anyone well. I forwarded the message to Mensa with a note that said, "Your read." He responded within an hour. "I think she means it. The question is what we mean." He was right. The question was not whether the council was extending a genuine invitation. The question was what humanity wanted from that invitation, what we were actually asking for. Not in the vague language of equal treatment or fair representation, which were phrases I had used so many times in my former career that they had worn smooth of meaning, but in specific, structural, contractual terms that could be written into a governing document and referred to when the inevitable future moments of friction arrived. I spent 3 days drafting a memo, not a position paper, not a negotiating brief, but a quiet document that tried to answer the question, what would a genuinely different arrangement look like? What would need to change, mechanically, in how the council operated, for humanity's participation to mean something different from what it had meant before? I consulted 3 people while writing it. Arthur Pemberton, who had by this point been promoted to Deputy Director of Monitoring and had a grasp of council procedural mechanics that rivaled any specialist I had known. Nadia Osei, the economist, who I had finally met in person at a trade conference the previous year, and who had the specific quality of being willing to say things clearly that most people preferred to leave vague, and Gary Holloway, who was now 35, and had spent his years since Vethsora Station in various diplomatic roles that had given him a detailed understanding of how mid-tier species experienced council membership, which was a perspective I needed. Gary, when I called him, was quiet for a moment after I explained what I was working on. Then he said, "Can I ask you something I've been thinking about for a while?" "Yes," I said. When Mensa walked out, he said, "Did he know this was going to happen? That we'd end up here?" I thought about it. I thought about the datapad set face up on the table, the jacket straightened, the walk to the door. "I think he knew what he was doing," I said. "Whether he knew exactly where it would lead, I don't think anyone could have known that. But he knew that staying and speaking and being silenced was producing a specific result, and he knew that the only way to get a different result was to change what we were doing. That took nerve," Gary said. "It took clarity," I said. "Which is harder?" The memo was 3 pages when finished. It contained 6 specific structural changes, a revision of the voting threshold system so that unanimous procedural actions, including microphone cutoffs and agenda overrides, required consent from a broader cross-section of seated species, rather than chair discretion alone, a formal mandate establishing an independent review process for sanctions affecting trade routes, staffed by representatives from species who were not party to the sanction, A new category of council obligation that recognized crisis response capacity as a shared resource, requiring maintenance funding from all member species, distributed proportionally to capacity and need. A mechanism for non-seated observer species to submit formal positions that had to be read into the record before any vote affecting them could proceed. Two other things. But those two were the most important, and the rest followed from them. I sent the memo to Mensa. He called me the next morning. "This is what we ask for," he said. "You think it's achievable?" I asked. "I think Suvathoran sent that message because she has already done some version of this calculation herself," he said. "I think she knows what the council needs to offer. The question is whether she can bring the chamber with her." "That's her problem," I said. "Yes," he said, "it is." We agreed that I would be the one to respond to her message and request the initial meeting. I spent an afternoon composing the reply, not because it was difficult to write, but because I wanted to make sure that every word in it was doing exactly the work it needed to do and nothing more. The reply was 2 paragraphs. The first acknowledged her message and confirmed that Earth was willing to meet. The second gave a time and proposed the meeting be held at the Valanthe observation post on the outer edge of the Saurian corridor, the same corridor whose suspension had been the occasion of our departure 9 years ago. I thought the location was appropriate. Orva, the Valanthe delegate, had already confirmed informally that the post would be available. Suvathoran's response came the following morning. 2 sentences. "The location is well chosen. We will be there." I had 2 weeks before the meeting. I used them to reread everything I had written during the council years, the formal objections, the position papers, the internal memos, the late-night notes I had made to myself when a session had gone particularly badly. I read it the way you read something old that you wrote when you were younger, with recognition, with some distance, with a clearer understanding of what you had been trying to say than you'd had when you were saying it. What I had been trying to say, across 22 years and 41 formal objections, was actually quite simple. We are here, we are contributing, we are worth listening to, and when we speak, you should let us finish. It should not have taken 9 years of silence to communicate that. But it had, and here we were. I arrived at the Valanthe observation post on a Thursday morning, an hour before the scheduled meeting time. I had come alone, without a support team, without aides or advisors. This was a deliberate choice. Suvathoran had requested a meeting, not a negotiation, and I thought it was important to honor that distinction. Negotiations were for later, when terms were being finalized and language was being reviewed by committees. This first meeting was something else. It was 2 people sitting in a room and deciding whether they could trust each other enough to begin. The post was small, a working facility, not a diplomatic venue. It had been built by the Valanthe for astronomical research and had a main operations room, a handful of secondary spaces, and a wide observation deck that faced the Saurian corridor, with an unobstructed view of the star fields beyond. Orva had arranged for the operations room to be set up with a table and chairs. He had also, I noticed when I arrived, put a small arrangement of flowering plants from his home system on the windowsill. When I asked him about it, he said, "I thought it should feel like somewhere people could speak honestly." I thanked him. He made a sound that in Valanthe communication indicated something between acknowledgement and warmth. Suvathoran arrived on time, accompanied by a single aide who waited outside the room at her instruction. She was tall, as most Thenari are, with the characteristic bioluminescent fringe that I had spent years learning to read for emotional context. It was currently a steady, calm amber, not quite neutral, more like composed, the color of someone who had prepared for this and was ready. We introduced ourselves formally, in the council protocol manner, and then sat across from each other at the table that Urva had set up. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for writing," I said. There was a brief pause. Outside the observation window, the corridor's starfields were doing what starfields do, which is shine with a consistency and patience that makes human schedules seem briefly beside the point. "I have been reviewing the record," she said, "the full record. Every session in which a human delegation was present, going back to the first year of Earth's membership. I read every formal objection filed, every procedural complaint, every request for floor time that was denied." "That is a significant amount of reading," I said. "It is," she said. "I finished 3 weeks ago. I have been thinking about what I read since then." "What did you conclude?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Her fringe shifted almost imperceptibly toward a cooler tone. That the record is not a record of an impulsive or difficult species, trying to disrupt established procedures, she said. It is the record of a species that consistently tried to engage within the system, was consistently denied genuine engagement, and eventually, correctly, determined that the system was not capable of incorporating them on terms that made the engagement worthwhile. I had not expected her to be that direct. I had expected the diplomatic version, which would have acknowledged shortcomings in general terms, while preserving some ambiguity about specific fault. The directness caught me slightly off balance, which was not a feeling I was used to in formal meetings. That is an accurate description, I said. I know, she said. I am telling you that I know it, specifically, so that we do not spend this meeting navigating around it. I liked her. I had not expected to form that assessment in the first 5 minutes, but there it was. There will be a formal session, she said. Before any decision on resumption is made, I intend to convene a full chamber session in which the record I described is read, in summary, into the official minutes. Not a brief acknowledgement, a substantive account, specific to your experience as a member species. Several delegations have indicated they will submit formal apology documents. How many? I asked. 11, she said. As of this week. More may follow. I thought about that. 11 out of 93. Not a majority. But it was not supposed to be a majority. It was supposed to be a beginning. The Valanthe document, I said. Have you seen it? I have, she said. And for the first time since she had arrived, something that might have been the Thanari equivalent of a suppressed smile moved across her features. Orva shared a draft with me. I have rarely read something that said precisely what it meant with so little additional language. Orva's people had submitted a document to the council 2 weeks earlier, ahead of the formal session. I had seen a copy. It was 3 paragraphs. It contained no diplomatic cushioning. It said that the Valanthe had observed humanity's treatment by the council over 60 years, and found it to be a sustained failure to recognize value until its absence was felt. It said that this failure had been costly to species beyond humanity itself, specifically naming 4 who had faced worsening conditions during the withdrawal period. It closed with the line that had already, in the 2 weeks since it circulated, become something of a reference point in discussions across the council. We were wrong. We were afraid of you. Afraid is not a good reason. Orva did not consult anyone before submitting it, I said. I am aware, Suvath Oren said. He is, as I believe the human expression goes, one of a kind. It is an accurate document, I said. Yes, she said, it is. We talked for 3 hours. Not about specific terms. Those would come later, in the proper framework, with the proper people involved. We talked about the observation post's stellar view, at one point, which led to a conversation about the Theric response, and what Helen Burke's crew had actually encountered when they arrived in the nebula. We talked about the Kalani, whose young observer I had not been able to stop thinking about since my last day in Chamber 7. Suvath Oren told me that the Kalani delegation had submitted the most detailed of the 11 apology documents, because their species had been most directly affected by the withdrawal, and their representatives had the most specific things to say about what that had meant. I asked what they had said. Suvath Oren reached into the document case she had brought with her, and pulled out a printed page. Printed, on actual paper, which was unusual enough to be noticeable. She set it on the table and turned it toward me. I brought this specifically, she said, because I thought you should read it in physical form. The Kalani document was written in an unusual structure, not the standard council formal language, but something closer to a narrative account. It had been translated from Kalani, which had its own complex grammar, and even in translation it retained something of the original language's quality, which I had always found to be a language that said difficult things with great care. The document described what it had meant to be a small species in the council chamber, what it felt like to watch the Saurian corridor sanction pass, and understand that the species most likely to have opposed it on your behalf was no longer present, what it meant to watch the Theric crisis unfold, and understand that the response came from people who had been pushed out of the system they were now being asked to save. Near the end, the document said, "We saw the human delegation leave the chamber. We were in the gallery. We were not there officially. We did not have seats. We watched them walk out and we understood what they were communicating. And we understood that what they were communicating was something we had not been permitted to say. They said it for us, with their feet, and we have not forgotten." I set the document down. I looked out at the star fields for a moment. "The young observer," I said. "The one who was in the gallery when we left. Her name is Kiva," Suvathoran said. "She is now the Kalani's primary council representative. She specifically requested that document be included in the formal session record." I thought about that for a moment. Kiva, watching us walk out when she was young, becoming the person who would walk into the chamber now, with a formal voice and a formal seat, because the world she had grown up into was one where the consequences of that walkout had reshaped what was possible. "What do you need from us?" Suvathoran said, "to make this work?" I told her about the memo. I did not read it to her directly. I had brought a copy, and I set it on the table. I told her what the 6 points were in plain language, and I explained, for each one, not the strategic reasoning, but the practical consequence. What each change would mean for how the chamber actually operated. How each change would address a specific failure mode that the existing system had demonstrated, repeatedly, with documented results. She listened without interrupting. Her fringe held steady at that composed amber for most of it, shifting occasionally but always returning to center. When I finished, she read through the memo herself, slowly, in the manner of someone giving each line its due weight. "This is achievable," she said, when she finished. "I know," I said. "I would not have put it forward otherwise." She looked up at me. "You are not going to make this easy for us," she said. "Are you?" "No," I said, "but I am going to make it straightforward. There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "there is." We concluded the meeting an hour later. Suvathoran confirmed she would formally schedule the full chamber session within 6 weeks. We agreed on a timeline for the structural review process. We agreed that the formal discussions would include representatives from several non-seeded species as observers with speaking rights, including the Kalani. Before she left, she stopped at the door and turned back. "Ambassador Vasquez," she said, "may I ask you something personal?" "Yes," I said. "When you walked out that day," she said, "what did you expect to happen?" I thought about it honestly. "I expected very little," I said. "I expected the council to interpret it as a protest and wait for us to return with demands. I expected it to be a harder 9 years than it was. I did not expect the Theric crisis to happen, or for the response to it to demonstrate quite so clearly what the absence meant." "And if none of that had happened," she asked, "if the crisis had not come, would you have come back?" I looked at the observation window, and the star fields beyond it. "Eventually," I said, "but differently, and the terms would have been the same. The work we did in those 9 years would have been the same. We were not building leverage. We were building capability. The leverage was a side effect." She was quiet. Her fringe shifted briefly to a cooler tone, then back to amber. "That is," she said carefully, "the thing I think we most fundamentally misunderstood about your species." "Yes," I said, "it was." On the day humanity returned to the council chamber, I wore the same jacket I had worn when we left. This was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply that the jacket still fit and was appropriate for formal occasions. But Gary Holloway, who was part of our delegation and noticed everything, caught sight of it before we went in, and gave me a look that suggested he had noticed. "Same one?" he said. "Same one," I said. He considered this for a moment. "That's either very dignified or very stubborn," he said. "Yes," I said. The delegation entering the chamber that day was different from the one that had left it 9 years earlier. I was the only returning member from the original group. The others were younger, in their 30s and 40s, for the most part, people who had grown up knowing that humanity had left the council and had built careers working on what came next. They did not carry the same scar tissue that the earlier years had left on people like me. They knew the history. They had read the files, but they were not marked by it the way that living through it marks you. This was, I thought, entirely appropriate. Gary was our newest appointment, which still surprised me sometimes, the quiet young man from Manchester who had once asked, "Are we leaving?" in a station corridor had become a thoughtful and sharp diplomatic mind. He had spent 3 years working with mid-tier species on economic framework questions, and had a grasp of the specific needs and concerns of smaller council members that would be extremely useful in the work ahead. Our lead delegate was a woman named Catherine Adeyemi, 41, who had been running Earth's Deep System Diplomatic Outreach Program for the past 6 years, and who had never worked inside the council system at all. She had been chosen specifically because she was not burdened by the old frustrations, had no personal grudges to navigate around, and approached the situation with the particular combination of intelligence and impatience that was, in my experience, exactly what was needed to make something genuinely new, rather than just restoring what had been. Catherine had been briefed thoroughly. She had also, I knew from conversations with her, done her own extensive reading. She had told me, when we first met, that she had read every formal objection I had ever filed. 41, she said, and not one of them changed an outcome. That tells you something about the system, and also something about the importance of not spending another 9 years filing objections. She was not planning to file objections. The chamber was full. The session that Suvathoran had convened was officially titled a Structural Review Plenary, which was a procedural designation that sounded dry but in practice meant that every seated delegation was required to be present, and that the session record had heightened archival status. The Valanthi delegation was in their usual seats near the left center of the amphitheater. Orva was present, which was notable because he had been discussing retirement. When I had asked him about it, he had said, "I wanted to see this. After I have seen it, I will retire." The Kalani were present in the gallery, as they had always been, observers, no formal seats. But their gallery placement had been changed. They were no longer in the upper rows at the far edge. They were in the center gallery, with an improved sightline and, at the specific direction of Suvathoran's procedural order, access to a formal audio feed and transcription service that meant they could hear and read every word spoken, in real time, in their own language. Kiva was among them. I saw her when we entered. She was watching the human delegation walk in with an expression I recognized, because it was the same expression I associated with people who were watching something that had been a long time in becoming real. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter and more careful than excitement. The expression of someone taking careful note of a moment that they intend to remember. The session opened. Suvathoran's fringe was a steady, formal gold. Ceremonial coloring, the Thanari equivalent of formal dress. She opened the proceedings with a statement that was unlike anything I had heard in a council opening in 22 years. She did not open with procedural announcements. She opened with the record. She had a document in front of her, and she read from it. The document covered 60 years of human council participation. It named specific sessions. It cited specific votes. It described specific procedural decisions, including microphone cutoffs, of which there had been 47, a number I had not previously known, and which landed with a particular weight when spoken aloud into a formal record. She read for 37 minutes. The chamber was silent for all of it. When she finished, she set the document down and addressed the chamber. "The record I have summarized represents the full span of humanity's participation in this body, prior to their withdrawal," she said. "I have read it because the Council's first obligation in this session is to acknowledge, formally and specifically, that what is recorded in that history is not a record of engagement. It is a record of exclusion. The Council formally acknowledges this today, for the official record, because acknowledgement is the prerequisite for anything that follows." 11 delegations had filed formal statements. She read the names of all 11 into the record, and noted that the statements were available in full in the session archive. She read Orva's document in its entirety. When she reached the final line, "We were wrong. We were afraid of you." Afraid is not a good reason. The chamber remained quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Catherine Adeyemi stood. She stood at the human delegation podium, the same podium I had stood at 9 years ago when Gress Von had pressed the button. She had a document in front of her, but she did not look at it. She spoke from memory, clearly and at a measured pace, in the kind of simple, declarative language that makes people feel that they are hearing something real rather than something prepared. She said that humanity had returned because the Council had taken a step that required taking. She said that the record of the past 9 years, the work done outside the Council framework, the capacity developed, the crises responded to, was not presented as a demonstration of grievance, but as a demonstration of capability that humanity intended to bring back into the collective space of the Council for the benefit of the species it served. She said that the 6 structural changes humanity was bringing forward were not conditions in the adversarial sense. They were proposals in the engineering sense, specific solutions to specific failure modes that had been documented and understood. She said she expected debate, welcomed it, and was prepared for the process of working through it to be difficult, because worthwhile things usually were. She said one more thing, and she said it without looking at her document. "We did not come back to restore what was here before," she said. "We came back to build something different. We are not interested in being tolerated. We are interested in being useful to each other. Those are different goals, and they require different structures. We believe those structures are achievable. We look forward to the work." She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Suvath Oren opened the floor for the structural review discussion, and the work began. I sat at the far end of the delegation table, slightly back from where Catherine and the others were engaged in the initial procedural discussions. I had an advisory role. My job, for this session, was to be available if a historical question needed answering, and otherwise, to stay out of the way, and let the people who were building the future do the building. I was entirely comfortable with this arrangement. Near the end of the session, during a brief recess, I stepped out to the corridor that ran behind the chamber's observation gallery. I needed water and a few minutes of quiet. The corridor was empty except for one person. Kiva was standing at the gallery window, looking back into the chamber through the glass. She had the posture of someone who had been standing there for a while. I stopped beside her. We looked into the chamber together. Through the glass, we could see the delegations in animated discussion. Several species representatives clustered together near the central floor, others communicating via their screens. The visible energy of people who had a lot to say, and were finally being invited to say it. "Your first time inside the facility?" I asked. "As a representative," she said. Her language was careful and formal, but not stiff. "I have been here before, as an observer." "I know," I said. "I saw you, years ago." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know. I recognized you when you came in today." We were silent for a few seconds. Inside the chamber, Catherine was speaking with one of the Thanari delegates, both of them gesturing at a shared document on a screen between them. "Is it what you hoped?" Kiva asked. I thought about the 41 objections, about tomatoes on a balcony, about Helen Burke saying, "Tell the council we'll have it done in 5 weeks," about Mensa setting down his datapad face up, as if he intended to return. "No," I said, "it's better." She looked at me. "What we hoped for," I said, "was to be heard. What we built, by leaving, was something closer to the capacity to actually change things. Those aren't the same. The first one is permission. The second one is structure." She considered this. "The Kalani will apply for formal membership," she said. "After today, the council reforms make it viable." "I know," I said. "Good." "It would not have been viable before," she said. "No," I said. "It would not." We stood at the window for another minute. Then Kiva said she needed to return to the gallery and went back inside. I stood alone for a moment in the corridor. The ventilation system hummed exactly as it had 9 years ago. The light in the corridor had the same blue-white quality. The floor transmitted the same faint vibration of a working station, with ships docked and systems running. Everything was different, and nothing about the station had changed. That was all right. Stations did not need to change. People did. Systems did. The rules that determined who could finish speaking did. I drank my water. I straightened my jacket, the same jacket, still fitting, and went back inside the chamber. There was work to do. Not because anyone had asked us to. Not because we needed the recognition. Because the work needed doing, and we were the kind of people who showed up for it. We always had been. That was the thing they had never quite understood, until the silence showed them.